The Minecraft universes are expansive and unending, and most are generally quite peaceful, but sometimes things go wrong, and a monster is created. This is the story of ENDERBRINE. The End, a dimension where almost nothing ever happens. There may be a few Endermen here and there, and a few abandoned cities scattered around the place, but nothing of real interest ever actually happens here. Well, until today. As the Great Spirit of the End, whose job it is to protect the End and its inhabitants, and the Great Spirit of the Overworld, who had the same job but for the Overworld, were in a disagreement. But as these gods were quarrelling over something unknown, their debate was getting very heated. So much so that the Overworld Spirit got so angry at the End Spirit that he punched the Ender Spirit. And that was disastrous. You see, the spirits are the physical embodiments of their world, and so when the spirit of the overworld attacked the End Spirit, it was almost as if the entire overworld was attacking the End. And so the two worlds collided. Death and destruction was around every corner as parts of the overworld just started crashing down into the End. Millions were killed, and the fatalities were continuously rising as the spirits continued to fight. But after a few hours, it became clear that their powers were even, and that neither one could destroy the other. They were doomed to be fighting forever, as neither of them was willing to come to an agreement on their argument. And so both worlds were going to be doomed to have to fight for all of eternity. And so it was at that moment that the void, which had been made to stop any of these fights, began to rise and consume the world and the spirits, as the void was the only thing that could kill a spirit. And so the spirit of the overworld and the spirit of the End ceased their fighting, and they both began just trying to survive, as they knew how deadly the void was. And so they both began to fly higher and higher, and as they did so, they both looked down at their worlds. The void had almost completely consumed them, and almost everything and everyone was killed. Both of the spirits had failed in their mission of protecting their civilizations, as now only the spirits remained. But maybe not, as the overworld spirit could still sense one being living within his domain. It was the Steve, the strongest creature of the Minecraft overworld. And so the spirit, knowing that the Steve was going to die soon, and so was he, as the void was catching up to him, thought that maybe he could survive by disguising himself as the Steve, as the void was going after the spirits, not the players. And so he dived downwards and took control of the Steve. And the Steve, who couldn't quite maintain the raw power of a god, is converted into a slightly different form, a form that many know as Herobrine. And so the overworld spirit was safe within the Steve as Herobrine. The Ender Spirit sees this and knows that if he doesn't find a host like the overworld spirit did, he will die, as the void will catch him. However, unlike the overworld spirit, he can't sense any Enderman life. All of his Endermen were dead, and soon he would be too. He didn't know what to do. He was going to die. But then he had an idea. Take the Steve from the overworld spirit and make him his host. And so he also rushed down and tried to take him. And he was successful. Well, partly, as he was able to remove the overworld spirit's control over the Steve's body, and he was even able to take part control of the Steve. But the overworld spirit was fighting back, as he was not going to let his Steve be taken away by the Ender Spirit. And so the Ender Spirit was only really able to take about half of the Steve. And so, with both of the spirits now technically gone, the void stopped rising, and the Steve was safe. Except, with two spirits now residing inside of him, the Steve wasn't able to cope with all that power, and so he blacked out. Several hours passed when he finally woke up. But because he'd been asleep for all that time, the spirits hadn't been attacking each other over Steve's body, and so they had become stuck where they were, and the Steve had become a monstrous creature, with half of his body possessed by the End Spirit, and the other half possessed by the overworld. Neither spirit could control the Steve, but they could both talk to him in a whisper. Also, some of their powers, in a weakened form, were now the Steve's. And so, he became the ENDERBRINE. So, he was now standing in what was left of the End and the Overworld's collision. And from where he was, everything around him just looked like an empty expanse of just nothingness. He didn't know what to do, but then the Ender voice in his head was starting to tell him to just
stay still.
But the Overworld voice was telling him to
run around and find something.
He was so confused on who to believe and what to do that he just decided to slowly start flying around, staying close to where he was originally. But again, he just couldn't see anything. Everything was just a dark, empty void. And so he slowly began flying further and further away, hoping to just find something, anything. But he would be unsuccessful in that search until a few hours later, when a bright pink beam soared into the sky in the distance. Instantly, the ENDERBRINE started running towards it, just hoping that this wasn't a visual illusion, that there was actually something there. And as he got closer and closer and closer towards that pink beam, he saw it. A portal. The voices of the End and the Overworld were telling him different things again.
Go inside.
No, run away, it's a trap.
No, go inside.
No, don't.
The ENDERBRINE knew that he couldn't be confused by all the voices in his head, and that this portal could be his only chance of escaping this empty void. And so, he ventured into the portal. He didn't quite know where he was, but this place just felt familiar.
This is the overworld.
No, this is a trap.
No, this is the overworld.
This is a trap.
The spirits were trying to convince him of two different ideas again. And again, the Steve within didn't know who to believe. And so he decided that he would just ignore those spirits, and instead he would discover the truth about this world for himself. As he wanted to know if this was the overworld, and if it was, whether or not this place had any forms of intelligent life, like that he had within his home overworld. And so, with the powers of the spirits, he began to fly across the world, now on the search for signs of intelligent life forms. And after a few hours, he finds something, as he finds a giant city. This was a marvelous structure. It was something far greater than anything he had ever seen built. And so he thought that the life here must have been extremely intelligent, more so than his home. And it was at that moment, as he tried flying into the city to see the creatures that built this, that both of the spirits began to speak again. But this time, surprisingly, they were agreeing with each other.
Now, you with my...
No, my powers shall become the gods of this.
But before they could finish their sentences, lightning struck down on the ENDERBRINE. And once again, he blacked out. A few hours later, he was awoken. But as he did, he felt different, as he couldn't hear the voices of the End or the Overworld inside his head anymore. He assumed that they must have just been killed in their lightning strike, as they were quite weak after they had both lost their worlds. But without those spirits possessing him anymore, would he have lost his newfound powers? He didn't know, so he ran to a nearby pond to look at his reflection, and he saw that he still had the appearance of the Enderbrine. And so if he still looked like the Enderbrine, surely he must have the same powers. And so he tried using his powers of flying, and it worked. He could fly. And so it was at that moment that he now realized that he had all the powers of the spirits, well, whatever was left of them, without having the annoying spirits inside of him. This was great. He was free. He was a god. And so he flew over to the city to see what life was there and how they had built this impressive structure. And well, he was stunned at who he saw, as in front of him were the villagers, the same dumb creatures that were in his homeworld. And so he flew down to them, to talk to them, to find out how these villagers were so intelligent. But as he came closer and closer towards the villagers, they all began running away from him in fear, as they didn't want to talk to him. They all thought that he was just a freak and some sort of monster, and so they tried to kick him away. But the Enderbrine was not going to be called a freak, especially not by the villagers. And so he leapt up into the air and showcased his powers to them. All the villagers stopped for a moment, and they all just stared in awe. They had never seen anything like this, and so they all realized that this creature, whatever it was powerful, and they should be scared. Meanwhile, the Enderbrine in the air was thinking what he needed to do next, as he had only planned to show his powers and he didn't think any further than that. But then he thought back to the unison of the spirits telling him that he was a god, and that made him think for a second. Maybe the reason that these spirits had stopped talking after that lightning strike was because they thought that he, the Enderbrine, was ready to be the god that they failed to be. And so he spoke to the villagers, who were all awaiting patiently.
I am the Enderbrine, and I am here to be the godly deity that my spirits failed to be. My world was destroyed because of them, and I will ensure that your world will not suffer the same fate as mine. But I shall only do this as long as you do everything as I say.
Now, the Enderbrine didn't really know how to save a world from being destroyed, but he wanted the control. And this fear tactic was the only good idea he had to get that control. And well, with the villagers already being scared of him after he showcased his powers to them, he was very easily able to control them. And so, over those next few days, the villagers were making monuments to the Enderbrine, and they were bringing all of their riches to him, and so they were doing anything they could to appease him. And the Enderbrine was enjoying all of this. He had never felt so powerful before, and he felt as if he was ruling the world. Yet still, he wanted more from the villagers, as he wanted them to showcase their loyalty to him. And so he started demanding sacrifices. And the villagers would be so scared that their world was going to be destroyed if they didn't do as he said, that they would go through with these sacrifices. And so, every few days, a sacrifice would be brought to the Enderbrine pedestal for the Enderbrine to take them away. Never for them to be seen again. No one knew if they were killed or if they were just taken away to some strange land by the Enderbrine, and they would never be able to find out. But what they did know was that they needed to obey him. And so this cycle of sacrifices would repeat itself for months, and the Enderbrine would continue to claim the lives of many, many, many villagers, and even some players too. This was a very dark time for the villagers, and it didn't look like life was going to be getting any better anytime soon. Until one winter night, when things would change, as there was a warrior called Casey, and Casey, unlike every other warrior in the city, had a plan to kill the Enderbrine and free the villagers. And so she opted herself to become that warrior sacrifice. But as she stood on that pedestal, she secretly had TNT with her. And so when her moment came, and she was teleported away by the Enderbrine, she was taken to a dark room, only dimly lit by some redstone torches. And in front of her was the Enderbrine.
Thank you for your brave sacrifice. Your world will be saved because of it.
However, before the Enderbrine could act, Casey started placing the TNT that she had secretly brought with her. And before it went off, she was able to equip her blast-proof armor. Moments later, the Enderbrine was dead, and all that remained of him was his skull. Casey picked up the skull and left the exploded remains of this room, and she began walking back to her city. And as she returned, everyone celebrated, as she had just freed them from the tyrannical rule of the Enderbrine, and so they were free, as they no longer needed to serve their evil Enderbrine. It was such a simple plan, yet somehow it had worked, but maybe not, as the Enderbrine wasn't killed. His death was all an illusion, and he will attack again, and he will get them through using their newfound saviour, Casey. And so to find out how he does that, you'll need to watch this video.